You know how sometimes you want to understand something complex, really get it, but you just feel overwhelmed by all the information out there.
Mm-hmm. Information overload.
Exactly. That's what we try to cut through here on the Deep Dive. We tackle those big subjects, sort through the noise, and pull out the crucial bits for you.
And today we're diving into something that's, well, it's everywhere. Sugar.
It really is.
Yeah, and this isn't just about, the sugar you put in your coffee. This deep dive is looking at the global impact, its long history, its effects on our health, the huge industry behind it.
There may be some ways forward, potential solutions.
Exactly. We'll touch on those too.
And guiding us through this is an AI analysis called The Global Cost of Sugar, Industry, Health, and History.
Right. Think of it as our roadmap.
Yeah, our shortcut to understanding how sugar went from being like this ancient plant to being in almost everything we eat and the hidden costs involved.
So the mission is to really extract the key insights, those moments where you go, aha, about how sugar has shaped so much.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting way, way back.
It's pretty amazing, actually. Sugarcane itself, it originated in New Guinea. We're talking around 8,000 BC.
Wow, 8,000 BC.
Yeah, but for a long, long time, its use was quite local. Didn't really spread far initially.
So it took a while to travel.
It did. Eventually made its way to India. And that's where people first figured out refining processes around 100 AD.
Okay, so refining is key here.
Sure.
But still, not exactly a global phenomenon yet.
Not at all. In the West, for the ancient Greeks and Romans, sugar was, well, it was exotic, an expensive import from India.
Relic of medicine.
Exactly. They actually saw it more as medicine, sometimes called it sweet salt. Can you imagine?
Sweet salt.
Yeah. For them, the main sweetener day to day was honey. It really shows how different our relationship with sweetness is now compared to then.
Totally different. So when did it start becoming,
well,
more known?
The Arab expansion was a huge factor. By the 9th, 10th centuries, they'd spread sugarcane cultivation and refining know-how across the Mediterranean.
Places like Sicily, Spain.
Exactly. Sicily, Spain, Portugal. But even then, it was still very much a luxury.
Still expensive stuff.
Very. Then you get the Crusades. That really introduced it more widely into Northern Europe. Knights coming back with stories, samples maybe.
And Venice saw an opportunity.
Venice, being the trading powerhouse it was, definitely jumped on controlling that Mediterranean sugar trade.
But still, for the average person.
Oh, no way. Still incredibly expensive, like rare spices. So it was mainly royalty, the aristocracy.
Using it sparingly.
Very sparingly. Sometimes more for show, like these elaborate sugar sculptures, than for actual taste, a real status symbol.
Right. Okay, so this is where the story starts to take a darker turn, isn't it? A shift from luxury to something else.
It really does. The 15th century is the big turning point. European colonial expansion kicks into high gear.
Looking for places to grow it.
Precisely. The Spanish, the Portuguese, they were actively seeking lands where sugarcane would thrive. Atlantic islands like the Canaries, Madeira.
And this is where forced labor starts creeping in.
Yes. That's the really difficult part of the story, often involving the forced labor of local populations on those islands first.
And then the transatlantic slave trade, which is just horrific.
You absolutely cannot talk about sugar's history without confronting this. It's central. Columbus takes sugarcane to Hispaniola in 1493.
And it takes off there.
Massively. By the early 1500s, Hispaniola is the New World's top producer. Portugal starts it in Brazil around the same time. Madeira was already pumping out thousands of tons.
The labor, that was the horrific part.
The sheer brutality and volume of labor needed, especially in those tropical climates, it led Europeans directly to the forced transportation of millions of Africans. It's estimated maybe half, possibly even 2/3 of the 12.5 million Africans forced across the Atlantic ended up on sugar plantations.
Primarily Brazil and the Caribbean.
Yes, and the conditions. Exceptionally lethal, just horrific mortality rates.
Unimaginable suffering.
Yeah.
And the British followed this model later on.
They did. By the late 17th century, British colonists in Barbados, Jamaica, they adopted the same system, built incredibly profitable sugar economies entirely on enslaved African labor.
So slavery wasn't just part of the sugar economy, it was the sugar economy.
It became the defining feature. It fueled European mercantile economies. Think about this. By the mid-1800s, half the sugar eaten by working-class people in Europe and North America was produced by enslaved people.
Half. That's staggering.
Sugar became the most valuable export from the global south, driving European wealth, the triangular trade, immense suffering, generating immense profit.
It's deeply sobering, thinking about that history behind something so common now. But things did start to shift eventually, production-wise.
Yes. On one hand, you had the rise of abolitionist movements putting pressure on the system and creating some demand for alternatives.
And technology, the Industrial Revolution.
Big changes there, too. New tech for crushing cane, for refining it. Steam power revolutionized refining. These sugar bakers in England, they were basically early factories.
More efficient production.
Much more. Plus, protectionist policies in places like Britain helped their own refining industry grow.
And all this meant cheaper sugar.
Exactly. More production, falling prices. Plus, you had rising demand in Europe, partly thanks to new habits like drinking coffee, tea, chocolate, all things people wanted to sweeten.
So sugar goes from luxury to staple.
Pretty much. Between the 17th and 19th centuries, by 1800, it's common on English tables, even for the working class.
The democratization of sugar, they call it.
Right, providing cheap energy for the industrial workforce. And consumption just soared. You see per capita figures climbing dramatically.
But it wasn't just cane sugar forever, was it? I seem to remember something about beets.
Ah, yes. Beet sugar. That's a crucial part of the story, too. Mid-18th century, discovery that beets contained sugar.
And then commercial production.
By the early 1800s, yeah. It really got a boost during the Napoleonic Wars when Britain blockaded Caribbean cane sugar imports to Europe.
Necessity's the mother of invention, I guess.
Sort of. And it led to these powerful European beet sugar industries, often heavily protected by governments.
Which made sugar even cheaper.
Yes. They could undercut cane sugar prices, leading to even more widespread use, especially in processed foods. It facilitated that mass incorporation.
What about artificial sweeteners? When did they show up?
Saccharin, the first big one, was discovered in 1879, non-caloric.
But not widely used right away.
No, its use was pretty limited initially, often became more popular during wartime sugar rationing, things like that.
So looking back at this whole sweep of history, what's the big takeaway about sugar's role in shaping our world?
It's that sugar wasn't just, a product of capitalism. It was a fundamental driver.
How so?
The plantation system developed for sugar, needing huge capital investment, and that brutal system of enslaved labor financed by European merchants. That became a model for other colonial commodities.
A blueprint for exploitation, almost.
In many ways, yes. The immense wealth generated fueled European industrialization, imperial power. But it also entrenched these massive global inequalities between the consumers and the exploited producers.
And making it cheap and available for everyone. That didn't erase inequality, did it?
Not at all. It just created new forms. Suddenly, the type of sugar you used, refined white versus, say, brown or molasses, became a marker of social standing.
Interesting.
And ironically, later on, as health concerns grew, excessive sugar consumption became associated more with lower socioeconomic groups, a complete reversal from its origins as an elite luxury.
Wow. Quite a journey. Okay, so that sets the stage. Let's pivot to the more immediate stuff. The biological consequences for us today, eating so much of it.
Right, because that cheap, abundant energy source definitely came with a price tag for our health.
A big one, it seems.
It is. So the basics. When you eat carbs, they break down into simple sugars, mainly glucose, which is your body's primary fuel.
And other sugars, like fructose?
Fructose, galactose. They mostly get converted into glucose by your liver. Your body has this complex system, pancreas, liver, gut hormones, fat tissue, adrenals, all working to keep blood glucose stable.
So where does the added sugar we eat, especially in things like soda, fit in? How does that disrupt things?
Well, liquid sugars get absorbed incredibly quickly. That causes a really fast spike in blood glucose and, consequently, insulin.
The hormone that helps glucose get into cells.
Exactly. Now, fructose, which is about half of table sugar and a big part of high fructose corn syrup, it's metabolized differently, mostly in the liver, and doesn't trigger as much immediate insulin release as glucose does.
And it's this quick hit, this different processing, that causes problems when we overdo it.
Precisely. The evidence linking excessive added sugar intake to negative health outcomes is really strong now.
Like obesity. That's the big one everyone talks about.
Major link, especially with sugar-sweetened beverages, SSBs. They pack a lot of energy, don't make you feel full.
No satiety.
Right. And potentially, fructose itself might affect appetite regulation pathways. The result. Global obesity rates have more than doubled in adults since 1990, quadrupled in adolescents.
Doubled? That's huge.
It's staggering. Over 1 billion people globally classified as obese in 2022. more than 40% of U.S. adults. It's a massive public health crisis, and sugar is a key factor.
And type 2 diabetes, also closely linked.
Very consistently associated, yes. Partly through weight gain, but also the high glycemic load from sugar spikes can contribute to insulin resistance. Your body stops responding properly to insulin.
And maybe direct effects, too.
There's evidence suggesting direct adverse effects of fructose on liver fat accumulation and insulin sensitivity. The global numbers for diabetes are just as alarming. Hundreds of millions affected, projected to rise dramatically. Over 90% of cases are type 2.
So, wait, diabetes. What about heart health?
Big connection there, too. High sugar intake is significantly related to increased risk factors for cardiovascular disease, things like unhealthy blood fat levels, dyslipidemia, high blood pressure.
And actual heart disease deaths.
Yes. Some studies, like analyses of large U.S. datasets, found that people getting 25% or more of their daily calories from added sugar had nearly triple the risk of dying from cardiovascular disease compared to those getting less than 10%.
Triple. Wow.
Key mechanisms likely involve fructose's impact on liver fat production, which affects triglycerides, blood pressure, and inflammation. And let's not forget dental caries.
Cavities. Sugar's the main culprit there, right?
Primary driver. Bacteria in your mouth feed on sugar and produce acid that erodes enamel. The rise in cavities historically tracks pretty closely with increased sugar availability.
It really seems to hit multiple systems. Any other conditions linked?
There's emerging evidence linking high sugar intake to non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, NAFLD, potential negative impacts on cognitive function and mood, and even increased risk of gout because fructose raises uric acid levels.
It's quite a list. Are there any sort of numbers that quantify this link between sugar intake and disease across populations?
Yeah, some large-scale econometric studies are quite striking. One looking at 175 countries found that every extra 150 calories of sugar available per person per day was linked to a 1.1% increase in diabetes prevalence.
Even after accounting for obesity?
Even after controlling for obesity and other factors, yeah. Another global analysis found similar result, suggesting that while weight gain mediates a lot of the sugar-diabetes link, there seem to be other mechanisms at play, too.
So it's not just the calories causing weight gain?
It seems not entirely. Which brings us back to fructose. You called it a key metabolic disruptor. Why specifically fructose?
Fructose is mostly handled by the liver, and its uptake isn't regulated by insulin in the same way glucose uptake is in other tissues. So it bypasses some controls.
Kind of. An unregulated influx, like from drinking a large soda, can overwhelm the liver's capacity to process it for energy. The excess often gets turned into fat right there in the liver, a process called de novo lipogenesis.
Making new fat.
Exactly. This contributes directly to those unhealthy blood fats, fatty liver, visceral fat accumulation around organs, all things that drive insulin resistance and CVD risk.
And you mentioned it doesn't make you feel full.
Right. It doesn't stimulate insulin or leptin, a key satiety hormone, as effectively as glucose does. So you might not get the same "I'm full" signal, potentially leading to overconsumption. The effects seem to go beyond just its caloric value.
It's like it hits the liver particularly hard and messes with appetite signals.
That's a good way to put it.
And putting that fructose, along with glucose, into a liquid form, that's the perfect storm.
That's why SSBs are such a concern. It's this harmful combination. A large dose of rapidly absorbed sugars, both glucose and fructose, delivered in a liquid format that provides poor satiety signals.
It's easy to overconsume calories.
Yes, contributes to excess calorie intake. Plus, the rapid sugar influx itself is metabolic stress. High glycemic load driving insulin resistance, large fructose load driving liver fat and dyslipidemia.
It explains why the link between those drinks and weight gain, T2D, CVD, is so consistently strong in studies.
It really does. While getting precise, comparable data across every single region requires digging into specific databases, the general trend is clear. Areas with higher average sugar consumption tend to show higher rates of both diabetes and obesity.
Okay, it's clear the biological impact is huge and multifaceted. Let's shift gears a bit. The idea of sugar addiction, you hear that term thrown around a lot. What's the science behind that?
It's a really interesting and controversial area. So our brains have a reward system, right? The mesolimbic dopamine pathway.
Dopamine, the feel-good chemical.
Well, it's more about motivation and reinforcement. It drives us to seek out things essential for survival: food, water, sex. When you do something rewarding, dopamine is released, reinforcing that behavior.
And addictive drugs hijack this system.
Exactly. They typically cause much larger, more rapid dopamine surges than natural rewards, essentially hijacking the system and driving compulsive use.
So does sugar do the same thing?
Eating sugar does trigger dopamine release in the reward pathway. It also affects other neurotransmitter systems involved in reward, like opioids and acetylcholine.
And this is where those animal studies come in. The rats showing addiction-like behaviors.
Yes, precisely. A lot of the sugar addiction idea comes from studies, often in rats, where they're given sugar intermittently, maybe after a period of food deprivation.
And what do the rats do?
They show behaviors that look remarkably like addiction criteria. Binging, eating large amounts very quickly, escalating intake over time, withdrawal signs, anxiety, teeth chattering, tremors when sugar is removed or opioid receptors are blocked, craving working harder to get sugar after abstinence.
Wow. Even cross-sensitization.
Yeah, that too. A history of sugar intake can make them more sensitive to the effects of drugs like amphetamines, suggesting shared pathways are being affected. And these behaviors are accompanied by measurable neurochemical changes in the brain.
That sounds pretty convincing. So why is it still controversial to call it addiction in humans?
Well, there are some important caveats when translating those animal findings directly to humans.
Like what?
For one, humans rarely consume sugar in isolation. It's usually part of complex foods, often with fat. Also, the specific intermittent access schedules used in many rat studies aren't typical of most human eating patterns.
Okay.
What else?
There's debate about whether the rewarding effect is purely pharmacological, something specific about sugar itself, or more about the intense palatability, the sweetness. Because even non-caloric sweeteners can trigger some similar brain responses.
Ah, so it could just be the intense sweet taste.
That's part of the argument. Plus, some researchers argue the brain's dopamine response to sugar tends to habituate, to decrease over time, more than it does with drugs of abuse. And the concept overlaps significantly with existing conditions like binge eating disorder. It's not always clear if food addiction is a distinct thing.
So human studies using things like the Yale Food Addiction Scale, what do they show? They often find correlations between food addiction symptoms and the consumption of highly processed, energy-dense foods, typically high in sugar and fat, salt, etc., not necessarily sugar alone.
Okay, so maybe addiction in the strict clinical sense is debatable. But sugar clearly has a powerful pull.
That's the crucial point, I think. Whether or not it meets formal criteria for a substance use disorder, the neurobiological evidence is clear. Sugar, especially in concentrated forms, powerfully activates reward circuitry.
The dopamine, the opioid pathways.
Yes, and this drives strong preferences, cravings, and habitual consumption patterns that many people find incredibly difficult to break. Even if it's different from illicit drugs, there's a real biological basis for why controlling intake is hard for so many.
And maybe the way some people do consume sugar, like intermittent dieting and relapse, actually enhances its rewarding effects.
That's a possibility suggested by the animal models, yeah. Intermittent access seems key to inducing those addiction-like states in rats.
So regardless of the label, our biology makes us vulnerable. And the food industry, they know this.
Oh, absolutely. Whether you call it addiction or not, the food and beverage industry demonstrably leverages our innate preference for sweetness and these powerful brain reward mechanisms.
To sell more products.
To drive consumption and profit, yes. We have this biological predisposition to seek out sweet tastes, probably evolutionary, signaling safe energy sources.
But the modern environment is different.
Totally different. It's saturated with hyper-palatable engineered products, optimized combinations of sugar, fat, salt designed for maximum reward.
And the marketing connects these foods to pleasure, happiness.
Exactly, linking products to reward, celebration, comfort. The industry effectively capitalizes on our biology by creating maximally stimulating products and surrounding us with pervasive marketing. They foster overconsumption.
Okay, that leads us perfectly into looking at the industry itself.
Yeah.
The architecture of modern sugar.
Right, because this widespread consumption doesn't just happen. There's a huge, complex economic ecosystem behind it.
We're talking agriculture, processing, trade, and deep integration with the massive food and beverage sector. It's got immense economic significance and, as we've seen, profound health implications.
How big are we talking market-wise?
Estimates vary, but global sugar market revenue is somewhere in the $65 to $85 billion range annually in recent years.
Billions. And growing.
Projected to grow, yeah. Driven by population growth, rising incomes in emerging economies meeting more demand for processed foods, the food industry's reliance on it, even biofuel use, though prices can be volatile.
And sugar substitutes, are they catching up?
That market is also expanding rapidly. Estimates are maybe $7 to $12 billion, still smaller, but growing fast.
Who produces all this sugar? Where does it come from?
Global production is huge, around 178 million metric tons recently. The giants are Brazil, maybe 23%, and India, around 19%.
And others?
The EU bloc, China, Thailand, the US are also major producers. Big producing regions are Latin America and Asia. And there's significant international trade. Brazil, Thailand, India are major exporters. China, Indonesia are top importers.
Who are the big companies running the show? You've got large multinational corporations involved at different stages. Major manufacturers include names like Associated British Foods. Their sugar arm does billions in revenue. American Crystal Sugar, Cargill, ADM, Raízen in Brazil, Südzucker, and Terrios in Europe.
And they supply.
They supply the huge global food and beverage companies, Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, Nestle, Mondelez, you name it. Food processors are the biggest customers by far.
And the market segments? Is it all just white sugar?
No. You've got refined cane sugar, refined beet sugar, which is actually the largest segment, currently raw cane sugar. And historically, government interventions like quotas, tariffs, price supports heavily shaped the industry structure, though there's been some liberalization.
Let's talk marketing. How do they convince us to consume so much? It must be more than just ads.
Oh, definitely. Strategies have evolved. Way back, they even positioned sugar as healthy energy. Modern tactics are far more pervasive and subtle.
So beyond TV ads and packaging.
You've got product placement, sophisticated digital marketing, social media, influencers, websites, even advert games targeting kids.
And the subtler stuff.
Using health halo terms like natural, associating sugary products with fruit, using complex ingredient lists that make it hard to see the total added sugar.
Obfuscation almost.
It can feel that way. And specific targeting of demographics, women, children. The marketing to children is a huge ethical concern, given they lack the cognitive ability to recognize persuasive intent.
How does the industry defend this?
Often by framing it as an issue of freedom of choice and opposing regulation. They also work closely with retailers, food service outlets, sponsor community events. It's multi-layered.
And globalization, how has that changed things? We talked about the colonial history.
Right. Historically, European demand drove colonial production via enslaved labor. Today, the landscape is different. Brazil and India are top producers.
But who controls the processing and trade?
Often still dominated by large agribusiness corporations based in the global north, Cargill, ADM, ABF's sugar division. And the industry's growth focus is increasingly shifting towards emerging economies in Asia, Africa, Latin America, rising incomes, growing middle class, but potentially less developed public health infrastructure and regulation, which raises serious concerns about basically exporting the negative health consequences we're seeing elsewhere.
You mentioned this symbiotic relationship between big sugar and big food. Can you elaborate?
It's crucial. The profitability and power of the sugar industry are intrinsically linked to the processed food and beverage industry.
Because sugar is a key ingredient.
A cornerstone ingredient. It's cheap, versatile, adds bulk, texture, browning, acts as a preservative, incredibly functional. Food processors are their primary customer.
So they depend on each other.
Deeply interdependent. This creates allied economic interests, and they often present a united front in opposing public health regulations like taxes or labeling changes, coordinated lobbying, funding counter-research, joint PR efforts. It's a powerful alliance.
A very powerful alliance indeed.
Okay.
This next topic feels particularly heavy. Manufacturing doubt. The industry's influence on science and policy.
Yes, this is a critical piece of the puzzle. The evidence is quite compelling, revealing a decades-long pattern of the sugar industry actively working to shape research agendas, dietary guidelines, and public perception to protect its interests.
Mirroring other industries.
The parallels with tobacco industry tactics are often drawn, and for good reason.
Can you give us some historical examples? You mentioned the Sugar Research Foundation earlier.
Right. The SRF, established in 1943, later evolved into the Sugar Association and the World Sugar Research Organization. In the 1960s, they orchestrated a significant campaign specifically to downplay sugar's role in coronary heart disease, CHD.
How did they do that?
In 1965, the SRF secretly paid Harvard scientists, quite prominent ones, the equivalent of about $50,000 today, to publish a literature review.
Secretly.
The funding wasn't disclosed, and the SRF selected the papers for review, provided input, basically steered the project.
And the conclusion.
The resulting review, published in the prestigious New England Journal of Medicine in 1967, essentially concluded that reducing fat and cholesterol was the only dietary intervention needed to prevent CHD, minimizing the evidence linking sugar.
Shifting the blame squarely onto fat.
Precisely. Then there's the case of SRF's Project 259 in the late 60s. This was their own animal research.
What did it find?
Preliminary results apparently linked sucrose consumption in rats to higher blood triglycerides, a known CVD risk factor, and potentially to markers associated with bladder cancer.
What happened to the research?
The SRF terminated the funding before it was completed and never published the results. Potentially damaging evidence was effectively buried.
That's deeply concerning. Any other examples?
Yes, influencing dental research too. Analysis shows the International Sugar Research Foundation, which SRF became, heavily influenced the priorities of the U.S. National Institute of Dental Research's major national caries program in the early 70s. They cultivated relationships. Their advisory panel overlapped significantly with the NIDR task force setting the agenda, and their report heavily steered the program towards interventions other than restricting sugar intake, things like vaccines or fluoride, which wouldn't hurt sugar sales.
So, shaping the research questions themselves.
Exactly. Diverting attention away from the primary dietary cause.
Are these tactics still used today in more contemporary forms?
Evidence suggests yes. Funding favorable research is a common tactic. Studies funded by the sugary drink or sugar industry are significantly more likely to find no link between sugary drinks and weight gain, for instance.
Funding bias.
Clear funding bias. We also see industry funding front groups, organizations that look independent but promote industry messages. Remember the Global Energy Balance Network, funded by Coca-Cola, pushing exercise over diet for obesity.
Yes, I remember that controversy.
Funding individual researchers, dietitians, academic departments, professional associations, it creates conflicts of interest and helps disseminate specific messages.
And influencing policy directly.
Lobbying against unfavorable dietary recommendations or regulations is standard practice. Reports suggest industry pressure influenced European bodies considering sugar limits, FDA task forces. Lobbying fiercely against soda taxes and mandatory added sugar labeling is ongoing.
And attacking unfavorable science or scientists.
That happens too. Criticizing the methodology or credibility of researchers whose findings are inconvenient. The Sugar Association has publicly attacked the scientific integrity of the American Heart Association over its sugar recommendations for children.
The tobacco playbook, as you said. What's the long-term impact of that early manipulation like the 1960s heart disease stuff?
It cast a very long shadow. By deflecting blame from sugar to fat for decades, suppressing other potential risks, steering dental research away from sugar reduction, it contributed significantly to public confusion.
Shaped guidelines that ignored sugar.
Exactly, and delayed effective public health policies. Arguably, it helped fuel the very obesity and type 2 diabetes epidemics we're grappling with today.
So it's not just isolated incidents, but a pattern.
It appears to be a coherent, long-term strategy, a systemic influence across the knowledge and policy ecosystem, funding research, cultivating experts, influencing panels, shaping public narratives, lobbying, all aimed at protecting profits.
It really puts the current health crises in a different light. Okay, let's talk about the pushback. How is society responding?
Well, as awareness of the health consequences grows, you definitely see more public health initiatives and policy interventions.
And clashes with culture, right?
It absolutely does. Sugar is deeply entangled in culture, which complicates things. Public health responses range from awareness campaigns.
Like telling people the risks.
Yeah, educational materials, programs promoting healthier choices. The WHO recommends limiting free sugars to less than 10% of daily calories, ideally less than 5%. But education alone often has limited impact.
So government interventions become necessary.
Often, yes, and we're seeing more of them. Sugar taxes, particularly on SSBs, are probably the most prominent example.
Do they work?
Evidence is mounting globally. Mexico, UK, France, various U.S. cities. They generally lead to increased prices and reduced purchases and consumption. Reductions reported range from maybe 2.5% to over 26% in some cases.
And tiered taxes, based on sugar content.
Those seem particularly effective at incentivizing manufacturers to reformulate their drinks with less sugar.
What about labeling?
That's another key area. Mandatory nutrition labels are being updated in many places to include added sugars, like the U.S. did.
Makes it harder to hide.
Increases transparency. And front-of-package warning labels, like the black stock signs used in chili for foods high in sugar, salt, fat, or calories. Those seem quite impactful.
Chile's law is often cited, isn't it?
Yes, Chile implemented a comprehensive law, including warning labels, marketing restrictions, and school sales bans. Studies show significant declines in purchases of unhealthy beverages afterwards.
Marketing restrictions.
Yeah.
Especially for kids.
That's gaining momentum. The WHO strongly recommends comprehensive, mandatory restrictions on marketing high-fat, salt, sugar, HFSS foods to children.
Mandatory seems key. Voluntary codes don't work.
Evidence suggests self-regulation by industry is often ineffective. Mandatory policies, like in Quebec or Chile, seem more successful. These restrictions cover various media and techniques.
Are there other environmental approaches?
Yes, things like traffic light labeling in certain settings, in-store promotions for healthier options, adjusting government benefit programs to incentivize healthy foods and restrict SSBs, multi-component community campaigns, improving healthy options in schools and workplaces. Cochrane reviews find moderate evidence for several of these.
But changing behavior is hard when sugar is so culturally embedded.
That's the challenge. Sugar isn't just nutrition. Historically, it was medicine, then luxury, a symbol of wealth. Think elaborate sugar centerpieces.
And as it got cheaper,
Its meanings proliferated. It became integral to daily rituals, sweetening tea, coffee, chocolate. Anthropologist Sidney Mintz argued sweetened tea for the British working class was transformative, providing cheap calories and comfort during the grueling Industrial Revolution.
and
Still strongly associated with pleasure, celebration, reward, comfort, social connection. Giving sweets is often seen as caring, though health concerns temper that now. Kids use sweets in socializing.
so even if we know it's bad, the positive meanings persist.
Absolutely, it creates this tension. And ironically, as we noted, excessive consumption is now sometimes stigmatized among higher socioeconomic groups, a complete reversal.
There's this constant back and forth then. Health concerns lead to policy, industry reacts.
Exactly. It's a policy feedback loop. Evidence emerges, advocacy grows, governments act. Industry pushes back with legal challenges, lobbying, reformulation, shifting marketing, counter-messaging. Policy effectiveness is debated, refined, attitudes shift. It's ongoing.
And that cultural significance, it's a real barrier.
A formidable one. Sugar is loaded with symbolic meaning tied to joy, tradition, love. Simply telling people to eat less often fails because it ignores these deep-seated social and emotional roles. Effective strategies likely need to engage with that cultural dimension too.
Which brings us back squarely to the ethics. Profit versus public well-being.
Right at that intersection, it forces us to ask hard questions about corporate responsibility, consumer rights, marketing ethics.
What about corporate social responsibility, CSR? Don't companies talk about that?
Many do. The European sugar industry has a code of conduct, for example. But critical analysis often questions how well these CSR statements align with actual business practices.
Like,
Well, codes might address labor or environmental issues, but often sidestep the direct health impact of the product itself. The documented history of undermining science, aggressive marketing, lobbying against health regulations, it seems contradictory to a genuine commitment to well-being. Concerns arise about CSR being used primarily as PR health washing.
then there's the whole debate about personal choice versus government intervention, paternalism.
That's a core tension. Regulations like SSB taxes or warning labels are often framed by opponents as paternalistic infringements on individual liberty, nanny state arguments,
The libertarian view.
emphasizing the right to choose, individual responsibility. But public health proponents argue that choices aren't made in a vacuum. They're heavily influenced by the environment, marketing, pricing, availability.
And that cognitive biases might impair purely rational decisions about diet.
Exactly. And that interventions are justified to protect collective well-being, address health inequalities, and mitigate the external costs like healthcare spending imposed on society by diet-related diseases. The harm principle gets complex here.
Marketing ethics,
Yeah,
especially to children, you mentioned that's cute.
very acute. Children's vulnerability, their inability to fully grasp persuasive intent. Marketing HFSS foods directly to them is seen by many in public health as exploitative, potentially violating their right to health.
Industry pushes self-regulation there too.
Often, yes, advocating for truthful marketing. But again, evidence suggests self-regulation is frequently insufficient.
And the starkest ethical point, making wealth on people's health.
It's a blunt way to put it, but it captures the economic disconnect. The industry generates massive revenues. Society bears staggering costs from diet-related diseases linked to overconsumption, potentially trillions globally in healthcare, and lost productivity.
So industry profits, society pays the health bill.
And when evidence suggests the industry actively promotes consumption, downplays risks, and opposes harm reduction policies, it strongly implies commercial interests are often prioritized over public health. health costs are effectively externalized.
It sounds like fundamentally different ethical frameworks are clashing.
That's often the case. Industry tends to prioritize negative liberty, freedom from regulation, and individual responsibility. Public health emphasizes social justice, equity, collective well-being, positive liberty, freedom to be healthy, viewing health as shaped by commerce and environment. Interventions are seen as necessary corrections.
And CSR is health washing. That's the suspicion.
The discrepancy between public pronouncements and actions to protect profits creates that suspicion, highlighting environmental initiatives while lobbying against soda taxes or funding biased research. Critics argue it's a strategy to improve image and preempt regulation without changing the core problem.
Okay. One last crucial area before we wrap up. Individual variability. We're not all affected the same way, are we?
Absolutely not. Population-level trends are clear, but individual responses to sugar vary significantly. It's a complex interplay of genetics, epigenetics, and environment.
Genetics plays a role in things like obesity, diabetes risk.
Definitely. Family and twin studies show these conditions have a heritable component. Genome-wide association studies, GWAS, have identified numerous gene variants linked to risk, although most have small individual effects. Some genes like FTO or TCF7L2 have stronger associations.
The thrifty genotype idea comes up here sometimes, too.
Right. The hypothesis that genes beneficial for survival during famine become detrimental in times of abundance. But crucially, genes interact with diet.
How's that?
High sugary drink consumption might amplify a genetic predisposition to obesity, for instance. Genetic markers might influence how well someone responds metabolically to different types of diets.
And epigenetics.
Yeah.
That's changes around the genes.
Exactly. Modifications to DNA or associated proteins that change gene activity without altering the DNA sequence itself. And these can be influenced by environmental factors, including diet.
Like sugar intake.
Nutrients are involved in the pathways that maintain DNA and regulate these epigenetic marks. Recent research links dietary patterns to epigenetic aging clocks. Higher added sugar intake has been associated with an older epigenetic age, while healthier diets linked to younger.
So diet might affect health and aging partly through these epigenetic mechanisms.
That's the idea, potentially involving pathways related to inflammation and oxidative stress.
On the environment itself.
Beyond genes.
Hugely important.
Yeah.
Socioeconomic status, SES, is a big factor. In high-income countries, lower SES often correlates with higher rates of obesity and related diseases.
Why is that? Multiple factors. Education levels, healthcare access, but critically, the food environment. Reliance on cheaper, energy-dense, processed foods often high in sugar and fat. Healthy options might be less affordable or accessible.
Food deserts and food swamps.
Precisely. Food deserts lack access to affordable, healthy food. Food swamps have a high density of unhealthy food outlets. Living in these environments is linked to poor diets and higher disease risk. Access is complex affordability, transport,
Cultural factors, too.
local food availability, cultural norms and traditions, the influence of marketing. Adopting Western dietary patterns high in fast food and sugary drinks is associated with rising obesity globally, especially where healthy food access is limited.
So disadvantage can compound itself.
That's a key point. The interplay of genetic susceptibility, living in an adverse environment, and potentially adverse epigenetic programming can create compounded health disadvantages, particularly for vulnerable populations. This helps explain persistent health disparities.
And epigenetics adds an intergenerational aspect.
Potentially, yes. If diet influences epigenetic marks linked to aging and disease, and these marks can sometimes be influenced during development, it raises the possibility of intergenerational effects.
Like maternal diet affecting offspring risk.
High maternal sugar intake, poor early life nutrition, could lead to persistent epigenetic changes in offspring, increasing their later disease susceptibility. It means the societal consequences might extend beyond the current generation, adding urgency to interventions.
Right. Okay, so faced with all this complexity, what can actually be done? What are the strategies for charting a healthier course?
Mitigation strategies target both individual behavior and, crucially, the wider food environment.
Individual level first. What's the advice?
Public health guidance is clear. Limit added sugars. The American Heart Association suggests no more than 6% of daily calories. WHO says less than 10% free sugars, ideally under 5%.
Practical tips.
Reading labels carefully, scrutinizing ingredient lists, reducing or eliminating sugary drinks, choosing whole fruits over juices, modifying recipes. Being wary of low-fat products that compensate with added sugar.
But changing the environment has broader impact.
That's where population-level interventions are key, and where evidence, like from Cochrane reviews, shows more significant effects.
You mentioned SSB taxes.
Well-studied, generally effective in reducing purchases consumption, driving reformulation. Tiered taxes seem particularly useful.
Labeling.
Mandatory added sugar info helps. Comprehensive front-of-package warnings like chilies show significant impact. Traffic light labels show moderate evidence in specific settings.
Marketing restrictions.
Mandatory restrictions on HFSS marketing to kids appear effective, much better than voluntary codes. Comprehensive policies are recommended.
What about just changing what's available?
Increasing availability and promotion of healthy beverages while reducing access to SSBs in schools, workplaces, communities. Moderate evidence supports this. Adjusting government benefit programs to incentivize healthy choices also shows effectiveness.
Are these big interventions worth the cost?
Cost-effectiveness analyses generally show population-level interventions, especially SSB taxes, are highly cost-effective, often even cost-saving in the long run.
How do they figure that out?
Economic modeling, microsimulation studies, they project substantial health gains, quality-adjusted life years, gained reduced healthcare costs, sometimes even net cost savings to government from things like national SSB taxes. Added sugar labeling also projects as cost-effective.
So systemic changes are for the biggest bang for the buck.
It appears so. While individual choices matter, environmental interventions that shift the choice architecture for everyone tend to have the most significant, equitable, and cost-effective population impact.
But the design of the policy is crucial.
Absolutely critical. Tiered taxes incentivize reformulation more strongly. Comprehensive laws addressing multiple factors, like chilies, seem more impactful than isolated measures. Clarity of labels, scope of marketing bans, incentive levels, all influence outcomes. Careful, evidence-informed design is essential.
Okay, quite a journey through the world of sugar. To quickly recap the key takeaways from this deep dive.
We've seen sugar's profound historical and economic impact, deeply tied to colonialism and slavery. We've looked at the serious biological consequences of overconsumption, obesity, diabetes, heart disease.
The complexities of the brain's response, maybe not addiction strictly, but a powerful drive. The huge industry shaping consumption.
Right. The disturbing evidence of industry influence on science and policy, the societal pushback happening now, butting up against deep cultural entanglements.
The sharp ethical dilemmas of profit versus public health, and finally, the role of individual variability genetics, epigenetics, interacting with our environment.
Yeah, covering a lot of ground.
And if there's one central point that really comes through all this,
I think it's the stark reality that the pursuit of profit in the sugar and related food industries has often, demonstrably, come at the expense of public well-being.
that disconnect between industry revenue and societal health costs.
Exactly. Compounded by the documented history of industry actions designed to protect those revenues, sometimes by obscuring risks or fighting regulation. It's a concerning picture.
So as we wrap up, maybe a final thought for our listeners to chew on.
Given this history, this evidence, what fundamental shifts in our relationship with sweetness, individually, culturally, politically, might actually be necessary to reassess the true price we're paying for sugar?
What happens if we just continue on the current path? And what truly innovative solutions could help us chart a genuinely healthier course for the future?
Big questions, a lot to consider.
Definitely. We hope this deep dive has shed some light on the complex world hiding inside that sugar bowl. Thanks for joining us.
This is DigitView.